So we move into our final chapter, chapter 26, leading and managing projects. Let's take a look at the first area, and what we'll see here is that there's a focus on really the difference between project work and indeed project management and sort of normal day-to-day operational work. So really the key concepts in relation to a project are, firstly, a defined beginning and end. Secondly, specific goals and objectives relative to that project. Given point number one, we note that any project, and indeed every project, is temporary. It starts and it finishes. It's for a period of time. Last point is important here, and I can't emphasize this enough. I'll explain in more detail what the magic triangle is later on in this particular mind map, but essentially what we're talking about with projects is that there are several variables that are core. We're talking about time, cost, and quality. Now often scope is added in as well, but what I mean in effect is that the success or otherwise of a project is really down to those three areas: time, cost, and quality. And generally speaking, within SBL exam questions, the examiner tends to introduce project management and projects in the form of some sort of issue, some sort of problem. We won't get a situation where, let's say, there's a requirement or a question or scenario based on a project going extremely well. It'll be the reverse. Now, why is the project failing? Why is it stalling? Why are there problems? Highly likely to be in the area of the magic triangle. In other words, there's a problem with cost. There's a problem with time. There's an issue with quality. And as mentioned, sort of linked into that, this area of scope. And scope is important because scope really, the scope of any project is really set out at the outset. In other words, what are we required to do? What are the deliverables? A, B, and C. That's what we need to do. And what tends to happen in project management, and indeed with a lot of projects, is that the project starts creeping out into different areas. So in essence, just in relation to this first point, the key area for me is that projects are different, and also they're sort of hinged on this idea that there are these constraints. More of that later. Outside of what I've just said, what are the sort of distinguishing features of projects? Well, clearly, when a company decides on a particular project, it's going to need to make up a team. And it may well be that this team will be sort of multidisciplinary, cross-functional. We may bring someone in from finance, from marketing, from sales, etc., etc. So really, one of the key jobs of the project manager, i.e. the sort of main stakeholder, the overseer, and the success or otherwise of projects, is to make up this team, is to choose the individuals associated with this team. And we'll see when we look at the sort of detailed stakeholders in relation to projects that there is a variety of different stakeholders with every project, and we need to be familiar with the names. I've mentioned the project manager. There will of course be the project team, the sponsor, the champion, the steering group, etc. Make sure that you have a fix on the key stakeholders and indeed what their role and responsibilities are. In addition to what we said up top, projects are once only. They're stand alone. In other words, we decide on a given project, it has deliverables. Once that's done, that's it. That project is finished. And as we'll see towards the end of this particular mind map, what we should be doing project to project is really learning from the mistakes that we made. One of the key phrases in this area of project closure is lessons learned. Next point here I've mentioned up top, scope creep. When we come to the next section, as you'll see bottom left on project constraints, you'll see scope included in that area of the triangle, and it's important that we stay within the parameters set out at the outset. Linked into the triangle, obviously, we are going to have a set sort of end date. We're going to have a deadline. Projects don't just go on and on and on and on. We have a finite date, a closure date, as it were. And in addition to that, projects will be allocated a specific budget. And as I said when I mentioned the magic triangle, that area, excuse me, that area of cost is key because it's one of the three main variables of time, cost, and quality, with the add-in obviously being scope. So sticking to budget and making sure that we use the correct tools and techniques to allow us to monitor and indeed to stick to budget over the course of time is one of the keys to successful projects. Now, let's take a look at this next area. Now, I've mentioned it already, constraints, and indeed here is the triangle, as it were. So really what we'll see here is, the key sort of three or four, if you will, main areas. Now, cost is key, as I've just mentioned. Schedule, we're talking about time. Now, time, through the use of a variety of different techniques, will be broken down. We have an end date, but we will also have things called milestones. In other words, points in time, perhaps weekly, perhaps monthly, perhaps quarterly, where we need to hit various targets, okay? And this is critical. The idea of keeping a project on track in terms of time is one of the central focuses of a project manager. As mentioned, scope, obviously, we set out the scope at the start. We have to try to stick to it. And then finally, everything outside, on the outside, these 3 points, drives the quality. And if I was to pick really, let's say, one area that is crucial, or the most important area within project management, and certainly within this trial, it is quality, because there's no point in sort of being in line with budgets, being on time, and indeed staying within the scope if the quality isn't right. I mean, we have a set of deliverables with every project, and those deliverables, within those deliverables, are defined quality levels. So for me, and indeed for most writers and observers, the most important aspect in terms of the triangle and or indeed project constraints is making sure that the outputs or deliverables come in at the right quality level. Okay, so far what we've said is, project management and projects are different. In a number of different ways. Different to what? Well, different to business as usual. Different to day-to-day operations. Day-to-day operations go on and on and on and on. Projects are, in effect, temporary. We bring together people, we plan, we have a set of deliverables, and we have our constraints. Let's move on to the next area. And I discussed this stakeholders. Okay, so now stakeholders will be involved, obviously, from the outset, and indeed the list of key stakeholders will be shown in what we refer to as the project initiation document. Note that within project management, there's a lot of documentation. And indeed, if you look at sort of high-end project management tools, for example, PMBOK, you'll see that much of project management is about completing documentation. There's a lot of administration. Now, link back into this particular area, we will have a myriad of stakeholders. Let's take a look at their roles and responsibilities, and just remember what I said up top. More often than not, where the examiner introduces the area of stakeholders, he'll need you to understand what each stakeholder's role and responsibility is. And let's also remember from past studies within SBL that we have our go-to technique, don't we, for managing stakeholders, Mendello. Okay. Now, it doesn't work any different in project management. When we're managing stakeholders within a project, if we need to wheel out Mendelow's matrix, then we'll weed it out in exactly the same way as we always do. So we're looking at each stakeholder, we're looking at their power and interest, and those two things combined, remember, effectively mean their influence. And indeed, outside of that, once we've sort of pigeonholed the stakeholders within our grid, are they keep informed, are they key players, etc., then we're going to manage forward, key players, absolute high priority, high power and high interest. They are absolutely key. So an example, excuse me, within project management, who would be a key player under the banner of the various stakeholders that we're just about to look to? Well, certainly the project owner. And I would have thought also the project sponsor, the owner being the individual or group, if you will, that the project is being carried out for, the sponsor being the person responsible for providing the resources. Okay, so let's not forget our past studies and management of stakeholders. So let's take a look at the first one. We've mentioned the project manager. So in effect, this project manager will be managing projects. Now, again, with reference to what I said about stakeholder management, there's no difference to the duties broadly and the responsibilities of a project manager to any other manager. The manager needs to make sure that the project team gets things done, and needs to have obviously a series of skills, management skills, motivational skills, analytical skills, communication skills. So it doesn't work in any other way or any unusual way just because we're referring to projects. So, I guess in one sense, the buck stops with the project manager. The project manager has, in one sense, the ultimate responsibility to make sure this project works and to make sure the deliverables are delivered. What about the next one, the steering group? Now, this is a sort of an optional requirement. Imagine that you're involved in a project and there is a sort of a group that is made up of a series of other stakeholders in effect. So we may well have someone from management, we may well have a user or a customer, we could have a director, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the steering group really is there in a broadly sort of overseeing role to keep an eye on the project progress and indeed to make sure things flow smoothly. Next area for us is the owner. Now, I've mentioned the owner. Imagine a situation where, let's say, the accounting department wants to introduce an organization-wide new integrated accounting system. So I guess in one sense, the project owner will be the accounts department, the finance team, along with, let's say, the CFO. So if a project is being undertaken to revamp and indeed change an accounting system, then the users, in one sense, are the owners, with, let's say, the CFO at the top, okay? Really, the people that the project is being carried out for, okay? Now, the sponsor is important. I've touched on the sponsor already. In effect, we're talking about money. So when you see the word sponsor, think funding, think cash. This person is providing the resources for this project to be carried out. Okay. Next area for us is the champion. Now, this is what you might sort of describe as a sort of an informal role. This person doesn't have, a fixed brief. You've got to do this, 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 and this. This person, in one sense, is the sort of motivator. It says here, from the study, have vision to get the project going. But, along the way, this person, this project champion, will be the person that tries to keep everyone on track in terms of the vision. The vision, in one sense, is not dissimilar to the vision of a company. We're sort of talking about the ideal outcome. the perfect result. So, and indeed, from time to time, particularly if projects are large, project team members need encouragement, they need motivation. So this is someone who, in a sense, will be sort of there in a broadly overseeing role to try to encourage progress within the project. Okay. Last area here, important, the board. Now, this will probably be composed of sort of more high-end senior management. They have overall responsibility. So perhaps, a senior manager, perhaps a director or two. So overall responsibility for the project, slightly different from the steering group. Remember that the steering group technically is sort of an optional requirement, and the steering group will probably be on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, closer to the action than the board. It might well be that the project board meet once a month or possibly once a quarter, just to assess, where we are in relation to this project. So really, in summary then, going back to the beginnings here, we said that stakeholder management, and indeed stakeholders broadly, this area within project management, is no different to stakeholders as we ordinarily know them. So in essence, managed in the same way. Make sure that you have a fix on, broadly speaking, what each stakeholder is supposed to do, what their role and indeed responsibilities are. Okay, let's look at the next area for us, which is a little bit more detail in relation to the project management. Now, project manager. So here, what I've taken is the image included within the study hub, and this is really sort of, I guess, in one sense, an approach to managing. This is Adair's sort of 3-point model, where a sort of formal approach to managing projects is sort of laid out. And what we mean by that is that in one sense, where project managers, and note that every project is different, where project managers are trying to manage the success of a project, they have to balance these three areas out. We know from management theory and indeed leadership theory that certainly there are a variety of different approaches to managing people and to managing companies. And what Adair suggests here is the important thing to note is that, broadly speaking, there isn't just one area. So a manager shouldn't just focus on the task. Right, okay, here's our objectives, here's our deliverables. This is the most important thing. The team and the individual are not really relevant. We've got to make sure we get the task done. That's not the way to do it, nor should the manager simply focus on the team and ignore individuals and the task. So in essence, what Adair suggests here in terms of successful project management is there's a balance to be had between understanding team dynamics, dealing with individuals, motivating them, and indeed making sure the task gets done. It's not just one thing, it's all three. And in one sense, this is sort of similar to the broad approaches you see within particularly leadership theory, where, theorists suggest that really you should play what you see on the pitch. In other words, you should manage forward or lead forward based on the scenario that you're faced with, rather than, let's say, for example, have an autocratic approach, or maybe even a consultative approach, or a democratic approach. In essence, what Adair suggests is balance is required, broadly sort of work on a contingency basis, and emphasize the importance of all three areas. Okay? So this is specific reference to the manager and indeed how a manager can manage a project successfully. Okay? Let's look at the project sponsor now. Now remember, when I said, when you see this word, think money, think funding. So key roles for the project manager or sponsor even. Certainly funding, but also pushing the project forward in all ways, promoting, advocating, shaping the project, okay? Now, we have a lot of specifics here. You'll note that, obviously, in some of the mind maps, I've simply taken the information directly from the study hub. I think that's best because there's a lot of information here. So the role outside of the funding is to really work the project forward, shape, advocate, promote, etc. Let's take a look at the key responsibilities. Now, there's a lot of information here. Students get concerned as to, the amount of detail within study text and indeed within the ACCA study hub. For me, certainly in this chapter and in several others, there's a little bit over the top in terms of information. Do we really need to know the real fine detail in relation to the responsibilities of a project sponsor? I think we need to have a feel for it, but let's not go crazy. We don't need to go rote learning off these 5 points. Let's just get a feel for it. We know what the sponsor does. First things first, in terms of the sponsor, we need a project vision, and indeed the sponsor will work with stakeholders to devise that vision and to sort of reinforce it. In addition to that, obviously, risk appetite is important. Different stakeholders will have different appetites, whether or not that's sort of, let's say, risk averse or risk seeking or risk neutral. And that's important, certainly when you get large, complex projects that have risk inherent within them. In addition, this point here is quite important, responsible for the continuing validity of the business case. Now, what do we mean by business case when we think about projects? Well, in essence, broadly speaking, a business case is really the reason why we're doing this project, the reason why we should be doing this project. Now, we'll see later on in this mind map that the business case is going to be set out at the outset and indeed discussed and agreed upon. If you will, the business case is a little bit like the sort of raison d'etre, the overall reason why this is a project that we should be doing. And you'll see here, it suggests the continuing validity. Now, it may well be over time that perhaps something comes into play, whether or not it's internal or indeed external, that sort of undermines the business case. What made sense 3 months ago may not make sense now. So, this is an important role. Outside of that, it suggests here, responsible for governance. So broadly, we're talking about sort of management and direction and management. We're talking about overall responsibility. And indeed, outside of that, overseeing the project, risk management, as I mentioned up top. And indeed, bringing in important areas such as, financial versus non-financial considerations. And we know how important, within performance measurement that non-financial areas have become over the years. So that's key too. In addition to that, point number 4, to ensure that the benefits are realized. And for benefits, I think we can include sort of deliverables. The deliverables come alongside the benefits. Outside of that, final point, ensure tensions between permanent structures of the organization and the temporary structures of the project are management. In essence, that's just a shout out to the idea that clearly, we need to reorganize ourselves if we're undertaking a project or a number of projects, because obviously we're bringing in individuals from different functions, as mentioned, marketing, sales, accounting, production, etc. And this is going to affect day-to-day business operations. In essence, when we look at a typical project structure in terms of personnel, more often than not, a sort of a matrix style structure is the one that project managers and indeed sponsors would go for. What does that mean? Well, a matrix style means that, yes, we're bringing in a project team, made up of a variety of individuals from different departments, but they're still doing their own job. So in other words, you find within a matrix structure, yes, you have expertise, you have a sort of a cross-functional team, but still the individuals concerned will be doing or having still some connection with their day-to-day job. So that creates problems and indeed issues in many, many different respects. So that's the sponsor. Let's look at the next area now, which is the life cycle. So we've said, at the outset that the projects have a beginning and an end. And indeed, obviously, projects don't go on and on forever. They are temporary. So what are the stages? This is what the PLC would suggest, is that we need to be familiar with the main stages. Now, projects are different, but broadly speaking, every project is going to have some sort of initiation phase. It's then going to have some sort of planning phase, then an execution, and then closure. So in essence, it's a little bit like a loop. So really what we're saying here with the PLC is simply the progression through those 4 stages. And, if we outline them, and indeed the tasks and work packages associated with them, then we can sort of understand the processes and indeed what we need to do in each of those stages. So, excuse me, when we think about the initiation stage, I guess what we're sort of talking about is defining the project in some way. Then we're moving on to detailed planning and everything that involves. Then after we've executed, in effect, we're moving towards a sort of a control phase, aren't we? Monitoring control all the way through to closure. So really 4 main stages. And note that at closure, one of the things that we'll see, and this is examined certainly within the SBL exam, is just the practices and procedures involved at closure. It's not just a case of, we start a project, we plan it, we execute it, and then we close it, good night, and we're off to bed. What we need to do in this area of implementation review or post-implementation review is to learn from the project, because we may well be an organization, an operation that undertakes projects on a regular basis. So learning from experiences is very, very important. And to try and remember that phrase, lessons learned. This post-implementation review is a nice little area, and it's important for us. So we'll be walking through each of these areas as we go through this particular mind map. So let's talk firstly about initiation. In other words, how we initiate a project. Well, several things really. The first thing is the business case. In other words, we have an idea, or let's say ideas for a number of projects. Let's consider, in particular, from the outset, a cost-benefit analysis for each of those, note, possible projects. Now, it may well be that only one project or 2 comes out the other side. Not all projects that sort of come into play in terms of possible creation will move forward. And one reason for that is going to be the cost-benefit analysis. So let's remember that this business case, as I mentioned up top, is to some extent a little bit like a sort of a raison d'etre. The reason, and the reason must include a balancing of obviously costs and indeed benefits. Outside of that, clearly at the initiation phase, let's say that we've moved forward, we're comfortable, we've done a cost-benefit analysis, we're definitely going to be initiating this project. Then clearly, we need to know who the stakeholders are, in particular the sponsor. Because remember, the sponsor provides funds and indeed a number of other things. But without resources and funds, we can't do anything. The next key point is selecting, note, wisely the project manager. And, not everybody will be suited to being a project manager. Project management requires a number of skills. Obviously, management or standard management skills are important, but not every manager can be a good project manager. So this selection is key. Remember what we said up top about the role, duty and responsibilities of a project manager. Really, the buck stops with the project manager. The project manager has overall responsibility for making sure this project happens and that we get the deliverables that we need. Okay? Now, linked into this initiation phase, we talked about, business case, raison d'etre, cost-benefit analysis, then stakeholders. This area is important because outside of the sort of business case area, a feasibility study for a project that we're thinking about undertaking is very important. And what do we mean by that? Well, we need to know, is this project really a goer in all senses? Now, you'll note at the very, very top there, it says commercial. Now, that's linked into the business case consideration and the cost-benefit analysis. So it's important to us to understand the financial aspects of this particular project, because really with this, I would suggest that certainly the commercial side is probably the most important area. They're all important, but the commercial side is most important, because if we're in a position where it's clearly obvious from the outset that the benefits are not going to exceed the costs, then really there's no point in doing this project. There's no point. There may be solutions, or other options in the other areas, but certainly, if we have an excess, a definite excess of costs over benefits, then this project is more than likely a 100% no-no. Okay? So that's the first area. The second area is technical. So this is just note a series of questions. Does the technology exist? Now that might sound like a bit of an odd question, but let's remember that, let's say we have not undertaken a project like this before. And indeed, as a result of that, we're not, let's say, 100% savvy or up to date on the tech side. And in terms of answering that question, when we say, does it exist, it may well be that, let's say, a competitor has undertaken a similar project and they've used technology, and let's say it didn't work that well, or we're aware of that. So, we need to understand, and this is in all respects, not just, let's say, on the production side, but also on the administration side. And we know how important technology and disruptive tech, etc., has been to us all, businesses and individually, over the last 10 years. We need to be 100% bulletproof sure that the tech exists for us to be able to do what we're suggesting we can do within the business case. Next point is sort of operational, but sort of more high-end in one sense. We need to be undertaking projects that, help the organization meet its objectives. In other words, yes, we can follow through on this particular project. It seems like it has a good business case. Technically, it's okay. Cost benefits were good. But certainly, we need to ensure that in an operational sense, it's a good idea to move forward with this project. Is it going to help the business head towards its own objectives? Social, I would include here environmental as well, although it's not mentioned in the study hub. I mean, clearly we need to ensure that this particular project is going to be accepted, not just by the project owner, in other words, the group or individual that it's being undertaken for, let's say users in an accounting project, but by everybody. It may well be that there are some stakeholders who won't be happy about this particular project starting and indeed finishing. They're not comfortable with the possible outcomes. Okay, so we need to look at that. We need to consider all stakeholders, and indeed, we know from past studies within SBL that thinking about our social impact, thinking about our impact on people, not just in the organization, but in the local community, the public, etc., is important. I think the other side of this, again, it's not mentioned in the hub, is the environmental side. So in other words, outside of commercial, the financials, tech, do we have the tech? Does the tech exist? Operational, how does this tie in with overall strategic objectives and indeed day-to-day objectives? We do also need to consider the environment and indeed the impact in any way of this particular project on the local environment, because if there is a negative impact, that's an issue. Remember that the importance of social responsibility, and social responsibility would certainly cover not just your impact socially, but your impact environmentally, ecologically. We need, according to normal standard CSR theory, to maximize the positive effect of the business and projects on society and the environment, and to minimize the negative effect. So in this area then, just to conclude, we feasibility studies come alongside preparing and analyzing the business case. They're important, and it could be at the initiation stage, it could be that we see something, maybe once we've done this feasibility study, that makes us concerned about moving forward. Okay, let's move into our next area now, the planning phase. Now, again, I've taken this directly, as you'll see, from the study hub. In the planning phase, this is crucial. It's crucial for the success of projects that they are properly planned, and that we use our experience, our expertise, and indeed probably planning techniques to make sure that our plan is as comprehensive as it can be, and indeed that everyone is on side with our plan. So what sort of things would be involved here? Well, certainly the overall project plan involving the tasks and the timeframes. Outside of that, remember, we always link things back to the magic triangle, the quality plan. What sort of quality standards are in play, and what are the procedures going to be used to maintain that level of quality? Indeed, third point, the risk plan. A project is like anything else. There's going to be risks inherent within projects. We need to identify them. We need to establish their likelihood and impact. We need to manage them forward, maybe using TARA or an other technique. Last point here, we'll always see reference to budgets, okay? Budgets are key. We say when we look at the magic triangle that quality is right up there at the top, but clearly costs and indeed sticking to budgets is key also, okay? So that's one aspect of the planning phase. What about execution? So remember, we said within the PLC, we said 4 main stages. We said initiation. We then said planning. Here we're at stage 3, execution. So here, we're right up and running now. We're putting the project in place. So what sort of responsibilities are there? Well, clearly team members, well chosen by the project manager and probably the project sponsor, need to execute the tasks outlined. In addition to that, let me just move this across for you. In addition to that, the project manager, we know this is the key role. Performance measurement is on his or her mind on a daily basis. And clearly, we need to look at any variances between what we're supposed to be doing and indeed what we are doing. Remember, again, reference to the magic triangle here, cost, time, etc. In addition to that, project status reports. Remember that there will be obviously a beginning and end time for each project, but there will be stages. So we need to ensure that we produce status reports and indeed provide updates to stakeholders so that they know what's going on. As it says here, provide visibility. In addition to that, all key stakeholders, are responsible for PM or performance measurement. If they have specific targets, deadlines, etc., they need to be on top of them. And indeed, outside of that, where they aren't, they need to be able to take action. And that's all key stakeholders, the team, the manager, etc. Let's move into the next area, closure. Now, you remember what I said up top, that this is certainly an area of project management that the examiner tests reasonably regularly. This would be probably my top 5 or 6 areas. And what I mean is, once we get to that final stage, the area of sort of closure, which is going to involve really 2 aspects. I mentioned up top the post-implementation review. The other side of it is really what's referenced here, the sort of, the admin side. Closure in the first instance is really about, first and foremost, handing over the deliverables to the customer. You'll remember up top when we talked about the sort of PID document and indeed, planning a project, that the deliverables are going to be laid out and bulletproof clear from the outset. So the bottom line is this project is in existence and has been going on for the last 6 months to get these deliverables out. So that's the first thing that's going to happen. In addition to that, as mentioned, projects are all about documentation. And there will be, if you're using certainly a high-end project management technique such as maybe PMBOK, the amount of documentation is going to be humongous. So certainly documentation, in one sense, it's got to be filed away. So that's got to go back to the relevant department. Obviously, supplier contracts are going to be cancelled. Release the project team staff and indeed put the equipment back where it needs to be. And indeed, obviously, informing stakeholders. So you'll see here, in a broad sense, when we talk about stage 4 project closure, the first part of it, which is basically going to happen immediately once the project has closed, is really administration, isn't it? This is all about admin. And just referencing the point that I made early on, don't forget that, let's say a month or 2 or thereabouts after we've had closure, we're going to have some sort of review. And if you remember, the key phrase that I mentioned in relation to that review is lessons learned. So try and remember the 2 sides to closure. The first one, admin, and then the second one, probably a little bit later, there's going to be some sort of implementation review. And that happens a month or 2 after, because we want to get feedback from the customer in relation to how things are going. And that is why we take that sort of time period to give a chance for the project to be in play, let's say the system being used by the accounts department, etc. Okay, let's move on to the next area. And this is just a little bit more detail in relation to the business case and indeed, I guess, initiation. You remember, as I said, the business case is about, if you will, raison d'etre. It's about raison d'etre. So what's important here is really to understand why we are doing this project. So let's just read this carefully. This is important. So it aims to identify the costs and the benefits associated with the project in advance of the work getting started. So, we would use some sort of technique. NPV would be the obvious one to use, but there are others, possibly playback, etc. So, outside of that, in terms of sort of key steps, if you were to do that, what would you need to have? Well, certainly you need to have the drivers, the business drivers or the drivers of the project. You certainly need to be in touch or understand who the stakeholders are. And clearly, you need to do a detailed analysis to understand pluses and minuses, benefits and costs in relation to this project. Remember what I said, that if the business case does not stack up for a project, we can't do it. Everything else, yes, great. But if the business case is not balanced, we can't move ahead with the project. So this area is certainly important. Now, in terms of benefits, when we're looking at benefits, and we'll look at costs in a moment, the benefits of the project need to be bulletproof clear. Okay, bulletproof clear. We can deal with costs in one sense. Perhaps we can get more funding. Perhaps we can go to the sponsor. But the benefits of the benefits, and there's 4 key words. The benefits have to be observable, measurable, quantifiable, and indeed financial. So there's 4 aspects to possible benefits, and this would be a nice set of 4 buzzwords, if you will, to learn off. Do we need to know the real detail? No, but we need to know really the keywords. Okay. Now, in terms of costs, I've mentioned costs, and we've mentioned importance within the magic triangle. I mean, project costs can come in a variety of different ways, whether or not it's sort of capital, revenue, etc. These are just really some examples. Projects in one sense aren't any different to normal day-to-day operations. Costs will be in all shapes or sizes. The most important thing is that we identify all of them. And indeed, as mentioned up top, NPV will be a good way to sort of evaluate, if you will, the sort of balance between costs and indeed benefits. Okay. Next area here is just a reference back to tools. Okay, so we mentioned that more than likely, and indeed with most projects, the go-to tool is NPV, and you'll be familiar with how NPV works. We need the discount factor. We're talking about inflows and outflows, and indeed, ideally, certainly for a project to move ahead, a positive NPV at the outset. One of the problems associated, I guess, with using NPV in itself, or indeed for project management, is ensuring that you are able to collate all inflows and all outflows. I guess the other problem is the underlying issues associated with that sort of technique. We're trying to predict the future. We're guessing. So, it's difficult, but we need to use a technique, and that would probably be the top one. You'll also be familiar with payback and obviously discounted payback, ARR and IRR. Now, it's highly unlikely within an SBL style question that the examiner will go into any great detail about appraisal tools. All we need to know is that at the initiation phase, when we're considering the business case, we have to do a cost v benefit analysis, and we'll use a tool of some kind. Now, this area is important to us, the initiation document. You remember that initiation is stage 1. Okay, this is the first stage. And when let's look at the definition first. We're talking about a reference document. So setting out the purpose and scope of the project. Now, note, one of the reasons, and we'll see the detail of it in a moment, is it's so comprehensive, is this is a document that we're going to use throughout the project. If in doubt, let's go back to the PID. Is there a query? Is there some confusion? Well, the PID is our reference document. That sets out everything in relation to the project. Now, in terms of detail, if we were trying to put a PID together, you and me, for this project, which we're both project managers on. Let's just say that we're having 2 project managers on this project. What would we include? Typical PID questions. And what I mean by typical PID questions is, okay, we need to produce a PID. Let's start here. Let's have the section in relation to deliverables first. What are the deliverables? We need that written down in stone. They are A, B, and C. That's it, okay? So that's the first thing that goes down on the page. Next area, obviously, is the business case, the raison d'etre. In other words, why are we doing that? Why are those deliverables important? We need to do X, Y, Z because of X, Y, Z, okay? Outside of that, I mean, this question is really the stakeholders. So in the PID, we need to know exactly who all the stakeholders are, not just the project manager and indeed the project team, the sponsor, the steering group, the board, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Next key point is the constraints, and you'll remember me referencing time, cost, quality, and indeed, obviously, scope, with, for me, quality being at the top. Next key point is reporting. In other words, how are we reporting in terms of project, milestones, etc., etc., and indeed, who are we reporting to? So in terms of, coming up, let's say you and I as joint project managers, coming up with our PID, what do we include? Well, it's more a question of what do we not include in the PID. Everything is included in the PID, because remember, this is the go-to reference document. This is the document that's going to help us stay on track. If we've got questions, let's go to the PID. It should be, the answer should be in there. Okay. Next area for us is the plans. Now, there's a lot of detail here within the study text. I've cut and pasted some areas, but certainly on my review of the planning side, including within this particular chapter, it certainly is a lot. I'm not so sure that all of it would be examinable. I think what the ACCA have done here is provided you with a lot of depth, so you really have a good feel, not just for this whole area of PM, project management, but in detail about project plans. For me, it's a little bit over the top, I have to be honest, but let's take a look. So plans, what do we mean by project plans? And indeed, what is, the purpose of planning? We know that, after stage one, initiation, we do our project planning. And certainly, I would say it's probably the most important area within project management. So what do? Well, we identify the detailed tasks and indeed how long they'll take. We look at deadlines. We look at resources, certainly manpower. We look at the budget. And also, finally here, note, we identify any critical path. So really, the essence of planning, or the purpose of planning, is to understand what we need to do and what the variables are in terms of resources, people, money, etc. Now, in terms of this critical path, this is important. When we say critical path, what we mean is really the longest sequence of activities that determines the shortest possible time to complete the project. So really what we're trying to do, and this is linked into something that we'll see below, network analysis. If we were able to define a critical path, and note, you won't have to do this within the exam, don't worry. We would be really trying to plan in terms of, in one sense, the sort of, worst case scenario, and indeed best and middle case scenario. We need to understand how long it's going to take us, to do or to undertake projects. And the critical path is just basically that longest sequence. So in essence, it does give us the shortest possible time. Okay? Let's move on to the next area of sort of components of planning. So what sort of things would we use to plan a project? Clearly, there's the overall management plan with details certainly of stakeholders and roles and responsibilities. Work breakdown structure, all we mean by that, and this is where I say the detail gets very heavy. Work breakdown is any project is made up of a series of tasks, and these tasks will have different elements of work. So when we talk in the planning phase about work breakdown structure, we're simply saying we are going to literally break down every single task, every single process, every single action into its defined pieces of work. We may use some techniques such as Gantt charts or network diagrams in terms of resources. We certainly need to use some techniques in relation to cost management. Obviously, we have a cost consideration at the outset with the cost-benefit analysis, but we also need to manage and work costs as we flow through the project. Last area, which we'll touch on a little bit later on in this particular mind map, is the quality plan. Remember, for me, quality is the most important thing. Let's look at the next area, which is the first one mentioned, the project management plan. Now, this is really the sort of overall, or one of note, the overall planning documents. It's really used to coordinate just about everything. It certainly facilitates communication amongst our stakeholders, our myriad of stakeholders associated with this project, and indeed it provides a baseline for measuring projects, measuring how we do against, let's say, our stated milestones and deadlines, and facilitates control as well. So think about the project management plan as the sort of overall plan. Okay, so next area is just WBS. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I think this is where the detail gets very, very heavy in the study hub. I've mentioned that really work breakdown is about really fine-tuning every single piece of work that makes up every single task. What they say here is, that it determines the work to be done. And indeed, if we know the work to be done, we know the resources, certainly sequences, so it gives us a feel for what needs to be done first, second, third. Clearly assists with cost control and may well help us if we really have a good feel for exactly the batches of work required with each task, then certainly cost estimation is going to be easier. In addition to that, yes, it does assist. If everyone knows exactly what work is to be done, it does assist with communication, and indeed, as mentioned up top, it provides assistance in relation to measurement and indeed project control. Now, in terms of these work packages, they need to have certain qualities. It can't be vague. They need to be clearly defined and indeed manageable. We need to be able to estimate the measurement, and they need to be independent and integrated. Okay. Next area for us is resource plans. Now, I mentioned these are broadly tools and techniques that help us manage resources. I don't think that we need to know real detail. We just need to know broadly what a Gantt chart is and what a network diagram is. So let's look at Gantt chart first. Really, what we're talking about is sort of just interdependencies. We're saying, schedule development using resources without task dependencies. In addition to that, it assists us with the sequence of execution of various different activities. So there's a Gantt chart. When we think about network diagram, now I mentioned up top critical path. So this is the same sort of thing. Really, we're looking at really the activities that need to be done, and we're trying to get a feel for, what is the likely timescales for completion of each activity along the chain, and therefore in overall, what's the likely completion time in the shortest possible time for this particular project. So network analysis really uses CPA to construct a model for the project, including these areas. So, each packet of work, as it were, the time involved, and indeed, importantly, the dependencies between different activities. In terms of cost management, we know how important costs are, as mentioned in the business case. They're important across the board. So what do we mean? Well, really the budgeted, the anticipated, the estimated cost. Now that's difficult because perhaps this is a project that we haven't undertaken before, or we haven't undertaken something like this. And at the end of the day, budgeting is about forecasting. It's about guessing, okay? So outside of that, in terms of the possible techniques that we could use, just things that you'll be familiar with, i.e. we said up top, things like NPV, things like payback, etc., etc., etc. Now, in terms of progress throughout the project, we need to ensure that our estimation techniques, given that we're guessing, have several possible qualities. Now, there's possible approaches to this would be top-down estimates. In other words, the estimates coming from up top, coming from the management board, coming from the project board. We could possibly use a bottom-up approach. In other words, go from scratch. Let's really anticipate or forecast forward in relation to cost estimates based on a blank sheet of paper, and let's build it up from nothing. Parametric modeling is broadly a combination of the two. Really, top-down would probably be similar in one sense to sort of incremental. The idea that we've done a project before, let's just take it X plus 5%. Bottom up, the reverse. Parametric, a combo of both. Okay. Next area for us is quality, and we've mentioned this several times now in terms of its importance. Okay, we need to ensure that quality is maintained throughout the project. So what might be included in a typical sort of quality plan? Well, certainly the standards and the standards of quality required and the procedures that we're going to use to make sure that those standards are adhered to. In addition to that, communication channels. So who should we be speaking to if quality is not where we want it to be, or if we need assistance in some way? Third point, how we assess it. How do we go about assessing whether or not quality is at the level we need it to be? I mean, to some extent, quality is subjective. It's difficult to sort of measure it. In addition to that, what about action? So if we have an issue in the area of quality, what are we going to do? Is there someone we can go to? Who's going to help us with that? How do we remedy this? Next area for us is monitoring. Now, obviously, as we've said, with 4 main stages in the project, monitoring it after, in effect, we start the execution is certainly important. The monitoring and measuring of a project against agreed plans, and then the taking of corrective action if there's an issue, is key to the project keeping on track and indeed being successful. Okay, so how might we do that? Well, one obvious way, let me just go back a bit, is, as we see here, is project reports. Okay, project reports issued by the project manager and indeed circulated to stakeholders on a regular basis. Now, in terms of those reports and their format or their inclusions, there's no set format, but this is just the suggestion that I've ripped out from the study hub. Really what we're looking to do is to keep people informed on a regular basis. The real detail in relation to format is not overly important. What are the other key points in relation to this particular area? What we see here is that the current status of the project, in other words, in effect, a sort of progress report, should include our milestones. So I mentioned these earlier on and from the off. We are going to have points in time where we know what we should have done by that point. So it's important within our reporting area that we compare to what is called milestones and see where there's perhaps been any slippage or where we're completely off track. Next area for us is risk management. Now, we know how important risk is to any business, and of course, as mentioned, any project is going to have risks inherent within it, and it's our job to identify them. So we're talking about, some sort of most likely downside or pure risk that may have an impact and indeed a probability or a likelihood. So we need to assess, identify, prioritize, and indeed manage. In terms of this risk assessment, we need to know about uncertainties, We need to analyze each risk and we need to prioritize. Remember that broadly speaking, in terms of risk-free uncertainties, risks are generally quantifiable. We can come up with an idea on probability, let's say, and or impact. Uncertainties, we're really not sure about the numbers. They're not really quantifiable. So this area for projects is very, very important. Next area for us is, slippage. If we have a situation where, because we haven't identified a risk, we end up slipping in a project, or we end up having slippage, the project is not going to be completed on time. Now, what could we do to reduce the impact of slippage? Well, several possibilities. Okay, first things first. In the planning phase, we could perhaps add in what's known as slack, just an extra perhaps bit of time or resource, etc., indeed, to allow for the possibility of slippage. Certainly review and monitor regularly, not just project, but obviously quality, and indeed regular communication with all members of the project team and indeed all stakeholders. Maybe if we see slack, maybe we should, or see slippage, maybe we can increase the resources. Will that help? Or, worst case scenario, perhaps we move the actual project deadline. Okay, so several areas, several options or action points that could be used. Now, in terms of change control, here what we're talking about, as mentioned up top, if we were to decide, well, something significant, e.g. deadline or date needs to be changed, well, this is possible and does happen, obviously. There may be requests for changes throughout the project in terms of objectives or perhaps deliverables. Now, note that everything that we had planned to do is laid out in the PID, the project initiation document. Okay, so what we're talking about is really changing the PID. Now, in terms of change control, yes, it's possible. Yes, it does happen. But we do need to have procedures in place to make sure that any changes to objectives and deliverables are recorded and, most importantly, properly authorized. We can't just have key elements of the project being changed willy-nilly from time to time by anybody. Next area for us is closure. Now, I mentioned this is the fourth, I guess, and final area. And as I said up top, really two main sort of important points to here. So first things first, let's look at sort of evaluation. So we've got two main areas here: post-project review and indeed post-implementation review. And the thing to remember is that these things are different. You remember that I mentioned when we talked about closure earlier on, I mentioned about administration stuff and then implementation stuff. So let's watch for this here. So in terms of the post-project review, in other words, what happens, immediately as the project sort of ends, as it were. Well, the objective here is to sort of understand, I guess, how well the project management methodology worked. In other words, did things work out, broadly speaking, as we had hoped they would, given how we initiated, planned, and executed, and indeed closed? In terms of the benefits of this type of review, many and varied. Basically, one key point is that we'd like future projects to avoid any basic areas that we messed up on, given our project management procedures. Okay. In addition to that, certainly we would meet with members of the team so that they can voice their opinion in relation to their experience. And indeed, this takes place, as we know, right at project closure, because at that point, things will still be fresh for project team members and indeed all stakeholders. Now, this is different, the implementation review. So really what we're talking about there is, a month or two down the line, when customers or the user, if you will, has had a chance to actually use the project. In other words, what we did and what we were supposed to do, have they had a chance to evaluate themselves. So this is also key. What are the benefits of an implementation review? Bear with me one second. What are the benefits of an implementation review? Well, several. Outside of what we've just said in terms of, the management of the project, certainly we can take remedial action. I mean, what if once we sit down for the post-implementation review, we find out that there's an area of the project that isn't working that well at all? We can take action. In addition to that, improvements can be made to the project deliverables, both in terms for future projects, but also the existing project, the project that we have a problem with. And indeed, some more feedback in relation to project management procedures, a la the 4 key stages. Okay? So, we are concluded now. A fairly big chapter for us. And do remember what I said at the outset. There's some areas within project management that I don't think will be overly important to us or that will feature in exam questions. I'm talking about detailed tools and techniques. If I was to summarize maybe the top 3 or 4 points in project management or in this chapter that are important for us, I would say stakeholders. I would say the PLC. I would say certainly project closure, the implementation reviews, the real detail in terms of planning or cost techniques, WBS, etc. I think that's probably secondary to us. Okay, do look for questions, do practice. Good luck with your studies. I hope that you found that helpful. Many thanks.